Borderlands had a smell that no one who had never lived there could accurately describe to someone who had never crossed into them. It was not the smell of death exactly, though death was certainly present in the slow decay of ancient trees that had fallen generations ago and been left to return to the earth without ceremony or witness. It was not the smell of magic, though magic saturated every particle of soil and every drop of water that moved through the cracked riverbeds when the seasons shifted. It was something older than both of those things, something that sat at the back of the throat like a memory you could not quite name, like the ghost of a feeling that had once been enormous and was now reduced to its faintest possible echo. Mara Ashvale had learned to love that smell over 3 years of solitude, because it was hers and hers alone, and in a life that had offered her very little that she could call her own, the particular perfume of her exile had become something she would not have traded for anything the settled territories might have given her in exchange. She had arrived in the Borderlands at 21 years old with a pack on her back that contained everything she owned, which was not very much. A change of clothes, a knife her grandmother had given her when she was 12, with the instruction that a woman who could not defend herself was a woman who depended on the mercy of others. And mercy, her grandmother had said with the particular flatness of someone who had learned this lesson the hard way, was a resource that ran out faster than water in a drought. A small journal with half its pages already filled with her grandmother's handwriting, dense and slanted and full of words in a language that Mara had spent her childhood trying to learn and her adolescence watching fade from her memory like a dream that could not survive the morning. A pouch of seeds, 3 days' worth of dried food, and the songs, those she carried inside. Her chest, below the ribs, in the place where omegas were supposed to carry the warmth of pack bonds and the comfort of belonging, and she had filled that space instead with melody, with the ancient rising and falling patterns her grandmother had pressed into her memory with the same insistence that other grandmothers might press recipes or prayers. The pack that had exiled her was called the Iron Veil, and its alpha was a man named Corrigan, who had inherited his position from his father the way mediocre men so often inherited the things they had not earned, and who had decided in his 3rd year of leadership that Omega autonomy was a structural problem he intended to solve. Mara had not been the only one to resist. She had been the most visible, because she had the particular misfortune of being good with words and possessed of a temper that her grandmother had called righteous, and everyone else had called inconvenient. When Corrigan announced the new bonding protocols that would require all unmated Omegas above the age of 18 to register with the Pack Council and accept council-assigned compatibility evaluations, Mara had stood in the center of the assembly hall and said, clearly and into the silence, that she would rather live alone in the Borderlands than submit to being catalogued like livestock. And Corrigan had smiled the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and said that could certainly be arranged. She had not expected him to take her at her word, quite so literally or quite so quickly. She had been escorted to the Borderlands border before the next sunrise, with her belongings retrieved from her quarters by 2 enforcers who had the decency to look uncomfortable about what they were doing, even if they lacked the courage to refuse. The exile was technically voluntary, because she had made the declaration herself, and Corrigan was clever enough to frame it that way in the official pack record. By the time anyone who might have objected on her behalf had organized enough to consider doing so, she was already gone, and the Borderlands had closed around her like water around a stone dropped into a deep pool, silent and immediate and absolute. 3 years later, she was still here, and she had stopped being surprised by how little she missed what she had left behind. The cabin had taken her most of the first year to make livable, because livable was a relative term in the Borderlands and required considerable creative interpretation. The structure itself had existed before her arrival, one of dozens of abandoned shelters scattered through the region that had been built over the centuries by various exiles and wanderers who had passed through or tried to make permanent homes in the in-between spaces of the werewolf world. Most of those people had eventually moved on or died, their shelters left to the slow work of weather and time, and the particular aggressiveness of Borderlands vegetation, which grew, with an urgency that suggested it was making up for lost time after millennia of being told it was not real territory worth cultivating. Mara had found this particular structure because she had followed a stream uphill for 2 days, and discovered that the stream led to a spring, and water was not something she was willing to compromise on. The roof had required the most immediate attention, and she had spent the first 3 weeks learning to work with the enormous flat stones that the Borderlands produced in abundance, layering them over a frame of branches she had cut and lashed together with strips of bark, soaked until they were flexible. The result was not beautiful, but it was waterproof, and waterproof, she had discovered, was the foundation on which all other comfort was built. The walls she had reinforced with mud, packed into the gaps between the original stones, a process that had to be repeated every autumn before the cold settled in, but that she had come to find meditative in a way she had not anticipated. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical reality of pressing material into gaps and watching the draft disappear, about solving problems with your hands rather than with words, which had been her primary tool for most of her life, and which the Borderlands had gently taught her, were not always the most efficient instrument available. She grew food in 3 garden plots, arranged to catch the irregular patterns of light that filtered through the dense canopy. Root vegetables were her most reliable crop, because they did not require as much direct sunlight, and because they stored well through winter. And she had spent considerable effort developing varieties that were suited to Borderlands soil, which was rich in some nutrients, and deficient in others in ways that she had learned to read and correct. She dried herbs on racks hung from the cabin ceiling, and stored them in clay pots she had made herself from the blue-gray clay that appeared along the stream bank after heavy rains. She had no particular talent for pottery, and her early attempts had been objects of considerable structural instability. But 3 years of practice had brought her to a point where her containers were at minimum functional, and at maximum almost elegant in their rough, honest way. She hunted when she needed to, which was not as often as she had expected. The Borderlands were full of game that had never learned to fear predators efficiently, because so few hunters came here, and she could read animal movement in the undergrowth well enough now that she rarely wasted effort or ammunition, the latter being something she was careful with because her supply of it was finite, and resupply required a journey to the nearest settled territory border market, that she made only twice a year, and found increasingly difficult to motivate herself toward. Each visit reminded her that the outside world was continuing without her, which she knew, intellectually, but had grown comfortable forgetting in the beautiful, demanding sameness of Borderlands days. What she could not make or grow or hunt, she traded for at those border markets, carrying dried herbs and medicinal preparations that she had learned to compound from her grandmother's journal and from 3 years of experimentation. The healers in the border settlements were interested in Borderlands botanicals because several plants that grew nowhere else had properties that conventional pack medicine had not fully catalogued, and Mara had become something of an informal expert in their applications. She never stayed longer than necessary, never gave her full name, and returned to the Borderlands before nightfall, with her pack restocked and her social energy thoroughly depleted. This was her life. It was quiet, and it was hard, and it was entirely hers. And most days, that was enough. Most days. The singing had started before she even arrived in the Borderlands. If she was honest with herself, which she tried to be even when honesty was uncomfortable. She had been singing her grandmother's songs her entire life, in the way that children absorb the things the adults they love do, repeatedly and consistently, without being formally taught, and without entirely understanding what they are taking in. Her grandmother, Sarah Ashvale, had sung constantly, a low, continuous musical commentary on her own existence that had provided the soundtrack of Mara's childhood in the way that ambient sound provides the foundation of a place without you consciously registering it until it is absent. The songs had no names that Sarah had ever shared. They were simply songs, particular arrangements of sound that belonged to the family the way the shape of their hands, or the particular shade of gray-green in their eyes belonged to the family, inherited and unremarked upon. It was only after Sarah died, when Mara was 17, that she had gone looking in the journal and found the words written out, and discovered for the first time that the language she had always assumed was some regional dialect her grandmother favored was something else entirely. Something older. She had shown the written words to 3 different scholars over the years that followed and received 3 different confused responses, each more uncertain than the last. One had suggested a pre-pack era ceremonial language. One had suggested she had miscopied something from another source. One had looked at the page for a long time, without speaking, and then handed the journal back to her and said, very quietly, that she should be careful about where she showed that to people, which had been both the most interesting and the least helpful response she had received. In the Borderlands, she sang because the silence had texture and weight, and because filling it with her own voice was a way of asserting continued existence against the vast indifference of an uninhabited landscape. She sang in the Chihuahua, mornings while she tended the gardens. She sang in the evenings while she processed the day's harvest, or prepared the next day's materials. And she sang at night, particularly on the nights when the moon was full or close to full, and the light came through the gaps in the canopy in long silver columns that made the forest look like a place between places, which the Borderlands were, technically speaking, though she tried not to think about that too directly. The night singing was different from the day singing. She did not entirely understand how or why, only that when she sang in the dark with the moon overhead, she felt the songs differently, felt them moving through her chest and throat, with a purpose that the daytime versions did not quite have, as though the darkness and the silver light were doing something to the sound that she could not account for in purely physical terms. She had tried, on several occasions, to analyze this sensation with the same practical rigor she applied to her herbalism and her soil work, and had each time concluded that some things resisted that kind of analysis, and that the resistance was not necessarily a problem to be solved. She did not know that she was breaking seals. She did not know that the songs were keys, each one a precise and specific instruction pressed into sound by hands and voices that had understood exactly what they were doing, generations and generations ago. She did not know that somewhere beneath the Borderlands, deeper than the spring that fed her stream, deeper than the ancient stone that the spring moved through, in a stillness that made the stillness of the deepest forest night seem loud and restless by comparison, something was beginning, very slowly, to stir. She did not know any of this. She was simply singing because she was lonely, and the moon was beautiful, and the songs were all she had left of her grandmother, who had loved her without condition or qualification, in a world that had otherwise seemed to find conditions and qualifications for everything. And the ancient wolf heard every word. If you've ever felt like the things you carry from the people you've lost are more powerful than you realize, stay with this story, because what happens next is going to show you exactly how true that is. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because we tell stories like this one regularly, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The first sign that something had changed was not dramatic. It was, in fact, so small and so easily attributed to ordinary Borderlands strangeness that Mara did not register it as significant for almost 2 weeks after it began. The animals moved differently, not in a way that suggested danger, not the sudden silence and stillness that the forest produced when a predator of consequence was moving through it, but in a way that was almost its opposite, an increased presence, a quality of attention directed inward, rather than outward, as though the creatures of the Borderlands were all listening to something at a frequency she could not access. The birds still sang their morning chorus, but seemed to pause between phrases in places where they had not paused before, as though leaving space for a response that had not yet come. The deer that sometimes grazed near the edge of her furthest garden plot stood with their heads lifted and their ears rotating not toward her, but toward something beyond and beneath, the landscape itself. She noted these things in the journal, because she had taken to using the blank pages at the back for her own observations of Borderlands ecology, pressing her writing between and around her grandmother's densely packed script, with a care that she hoped communicated appropriate respect for the material already present. She wrote, "Animals distracted by something sub-auditory. Possible seismic activity at depth. Possible seasonal behavior I haven't cataloged yet. Possible something I don't have a category for." She drew a small question mark after the last entry and moved on. The second sign was harder to rationalize. She woke 3 nights running from dreams that were not quite dreams, that occupied the space between sleep and waking, where the mind was still doing something, still processing something. but with a quality of attention that felt received rather than produced, as though she were being shown rather than imagining. The content of these almost dreams was consistent across all 3 nights: darkness and depth and cold, the specific cold of stone that has never been touched by sunlight, and within that cold, a sound that was not quite a voice, but was not a voice either. Something at the borderline of language, the way the Borderlands were at the borderline of territory. Neither one thing nor another, but possessing its own complete and serious reality. On the 3rd morning, she sat with her tea and her journal and wrote 3 consecutive pre-dawn experiences that felt externally sourced. Reevaluate night singing. Possible the acoustics of the spring chamber are creating feedback patterns. She paused and added, or possible that grandmother's songs do what grandmother always seemed to think they did, though she never said directly what that was. Another pause. Another note. Ask the question you've been not asking. She did not ask it that day. She was not ready. She went out and weeded the middle garden plot and harvested the last of the autumn carrots and checked the roof after the previous night's rain, and found 2 stones that needed reseeding and spent the afternoon with her hands in the cold mortar mix she made from lime and sand and the fine gray dust of certain Borderlands minerals, pressing the stones back into their proper positions with the focused attention of someone who finds it easier to solve physical problems than philosophical ones. That night, the moon was at its fullest, and she sat outside her cabin door on the flat stone she used as a step and looked up through the gap in the canopy where the moon was visible as a perfect disk of light. And she sang. She sang 3 of the songs in sequence, the ones her grandmother had always grouped together, always performed in the same order, which she had always assumed was personal preference, the way some people always ate certain foods in a certain order, but which she was beginning with a cold, quiet certainty that settled into her sternum like the first ice of winter. To suspect was not preference at all, but instruction. The forest went absolutely still around her, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of listening. The distinction was clear enough that she registered it consciously, her omega senses reading the quality of the silence the way they read the quality of a person's stillness, the difference between someone holding themselves quiet out of threat assessment and someone holding themselves quiet out of reverence. Every living thing within her range of perception was holding itself in the second kind of stillness, and the awareness of this moved over her skin like weather. She finished the 3rd song, and sat in the silence that followed and said, "To no one, and to the night, and to whatever might be listening beneath the night, I know you can hear me." There was no response, or rather, the response was a shift in the quality of the air, a slight warming that had no meteorological basis, a sensation at the base of her skull that she associated with the particular way that magic announced itself in the Borderlands, not dramatically but with this quiet and specific insistence, as though magic in this place had given up trying to impress anyone and was simply asking to be acknowledged. She went inside and slept without dreaming and woke in the morning with the absolute certainty that something was coming, and that the appropriate response to this certainty was to make sure her root cellar was properly stocked, and her knife was clean. Kelar did not wake the way that sleeping things in stories typically woke. There was no sudden dramatic emergence, no rupturing of earth, no column of light or storm of sound. What happened was more like a tide coming in, gradual, inexorable, and so incrementally slow in its early stages that any individual observation would have shown only stillness, while the aggregate of many observations would have revealed constant motion. He had been in the deep places for a very long time, long enough that his first returning awareness was not of self, but of sound, a single thread of melody that had worked its way down through stone and soil, and all the weight of centuries to reach him in the place where he had chosen, long ago, to stop. He had not intended to sleep for 1,000 years. He had intended to rest, to withdraw, to absent himself from a world that had made clear it no longer needed or deserved what he had tried to give it. He had built the pack system, not in the way that gods in stories build things, with divine fiat and instant completion, but the way any actual work of construction happened, slowly and collaboratively and with constant revision. over the course of generations during which he had walked among the wolves in various forms, and taught and corrected and held the framework together against the constant pressure of individual ambition and collective fear. He had given them language for what they were. He had given them the rituals that regulated the biological realities of the omega-alpha dynamic, so that those realities served community rather than domination. He had given them the borderlands as a reminder that all territory was provisional, and that the spaces between things were as real as the things themselves. And then he had watched them take what he had given and do with it what people so often did with systems that were designed for equity and that required constant active maintenance to remain so. They had let the maintenance slide, generation by generation, small compromise by small compromise, until the system looked the same from the outside and had rotted through at its core. Alphas had consolidated power that was supposed to rotate. Pack councils had become hereditary in all but name. Omegas, who had been designed into the system as its most essential members, its primary conduits of social cohesion and collective memory, had been reclassified over the centuries from partners to property, from keepers of knowledge to objects of transaction, and the reclassification had been so thorough and so long-standing that most of the wolves alive in the last several centuries had genuinely believed it was the original design. He had tried to correct this. He had argued, had intervened, had made himself known in ways that cost him considerably in the currency of whatever it was that ancient beings spent when they exerted themselves in the world, and he had been ignored, or worse, incorporated, his own presence used as justification for the very power structures he was arguing against. The Alpha Council of the last era before his withdrawal had cited his existence as evidence that the Alpha hierarchy was divinely ordered, that his deference to their authority validated their authority, that his presence among them was endorsement. He had not been deferring to their authority. He had been attending their meetings in the increasingly desperate hope of persuading at least some of them to reverse course before the damage became irreversible. When it became clear that it had become irreversible, or at least that it had become more than he could reverse alone, and in the near term, he had made a choice. He had gone to the borderlands, the place he had always maintained as neutral ground, as the space that belonged to no pack and therefore to all wolves, and he had gone down into the deep places that existed below the borderlands, the way the roots of a tree existed below what was visible, and he had stopped. He had not expected 1,000 years to pass. He had not expected to lose track of time so completely in the deep stillness, but the stillness had been, genuinely, a relief after the centuries of argument and intervention, and the grinding particular exhaustion of watching things you had built with care be dismantled with carelessness, and the relief had been seductive in the way that all profound rest is seductive, and he had let it take him deeper than he intended. The voice had reached him anyway, or rather, the specific voice of a specific lineage had reached him, because not all voices could, not all sound traveled through that much stone and time. Only the cantoras could do it. The singing women. The line he had established specifically for this purpose, who carried in their blood and their learned patterns of vocalization, the particular frequencies that his resting state remained attuned to regardless of depth. He had established this failsafe because he had known himself well enough to know that he might one day need to be called back from a place he could not return from on his own, and he had been wise enough to acknowledge this about himself, even if the wisdom had taken many centuries to develop. He had not expected it to take so long. He had not expected the line to narrow so dramatically, the cantoras to be reduced over the centuries, from an established and respected order, to a single woman singing alone in the dark, in an exile she had chosen over submission. The fact of her exile moved through him, as he came slowly back to awareness, moved through him the way that deeply familiar pain moves through a body that has learned to accommodate it, without being diminished by it, with recognition and with anger. The anger not sharp, but old and enormous and very quiet. She did not know what she was doing. He could tell this immediately, could read it in the way the songs were perfectly constructed in their technical elements and completely innocent in their intentionality. The way a child might play a complex piece of music without understanding the mathematics underlying it, producing the correct sounds through pattern recognition and muscle memory, without any conceptual access to the principles that made the sounds mean what they meant. She had inherited the form without the context, which made sense given how thoroughly the Cantora tradition had been suppressed over the centuries, and which meant that she was waking. Him with the same complete confidence of someone doing an entirely ordinary thing like drawing water from a well, with no awareness that the well was very deep and that what she was drawing up was not what she thought it was. He did not rush the return to full awareness. He had learned, over his very long life, that rushing the return from deep rest produced a kind of cognitive violence that was counterproductive to everything that came after, and that the time spent coming back properly was always worthwhile. He let the thread of her voice guide him upward, through the layers of his own stillness, the way you might follow a single rope through complete darkness, hand over hand. No destination visible, but the rope itself, reliable and constant. When he finally reached the surface of consciousness, when he finally opened what were metaphorically, if not literally, his eyes on the awareness of his own existence and the existence of the world around him, the first coherent thought he had was, "She is angry." He could feel it in the music, even through the stone, even through the distance, the way that certain emotional states color everything that proceeds from them, whether or not the person experiencing those states intends that coloring. She was angry, and she was lonely, and she was, underneath both of those things, profoundly unbroken in a way that surprised him more than anything else he had encountered in a very long time. He had expected, given the conditions of her exile, to find someone diminished. He found instead someone who had been stripped down to her essential self, and discovered that the essential self was more than adequate. He was not, he noted with a detached curiosity, that was itself a sign of how long he had been away from the world, entirely indifferent to this. Don't go anywhere, because the moment these two actually encounter each other is going to redefine everything you think you know about power and choice. If you're feeling this story, drop a comment below and let me know what you think is going to happen when the ancient wolf finally makes himself known. Your predictions are always one of the best parts of telling these stories together. The first direct sign of him was a sound she heard on a Tuesday morning, which was a day she had designated for maintenance and repairs, and which she was spending on the far side of the stream, resetting some of the stone markers she used to track the boundaries of her foraging territory. The sound was low and resonant, and came from beneath the ground, with enough clarity and presence that she straightened immediately, and stood very still, reading it the way she read all sounds in the Borderlands, with the full deployment of her Omega senses, running cross-reference checks against everything she knew about the soundscape of her particular piece of territory. It was not an animal. It was not a geological event of the ordinary variety, though the Borderlands did occasionally produce sounds, from deep seismic adjustments that were unique to the region, and that she had learned to distinguish from more immediate concerns. It was not the wind working through rock formations, which produced specific patterns she had catalogued. It was something that had no entry in any of her mental catalogues, a deep and sustained resonance that she felt in her chest and the soles of her feet simultaneously, that lasted for approximately 4 seconds, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. She stood still for another full minute after it stopped, listening to the silence that followed it, which had a different texture from the silence that had preceded it, fuller somehow, occupied by something that had not been present before. Then she picked up her tools and her pack and walked back across the stream to her cabin, and sat down at the table she had made from 2 large slabs of Borderlands hardwood, and opened her journal to the current page and wrote, with the careful precision of someone making an official record of something consequential. Day 1127 in the Borderlands. Subground resonance event. Single occurrence. Approximately 4 seconds duration. No physical damage or movement observed. Quality unlike any previous Borderlands acoustic phenomena. Note: the silence after it felt inhabited. She underlined the word inhabited, and then sat looking at it for a while before closing the journal and starting lunch. The second sign came 3 days later, and was considerably less easy to write down with clinical detachment. She was in the garden, the smallest one, the one she had planted with the most experimental combinations of her hybrid seed varieties, and she was on her knees in the soil doing the slow, meditative work of careful weeding, which required her to be close to the ground and attentive to the difference between what she had planted and what had arrived uninvited, when she became aware that the quality of the light had changed. Not the amount. The quality. The light that was falling on her hands and on the dark soil around them had the character of late afternoon light, golden and angled, even though it was mid-morning, and the sun was nowhere near the angle that would produce that effect. She looked up slowly, without sudden movement, and the light was the same everywhere she looked, the same warm, impossible gold, and there was something in it that she did not have a word for, a kind of weight, a presence, as though the light itself was aware of what it was illuminating. She said aloud, to the garden, "I would appreciate it if whatever this is would communicate more directly." The light shifted. Just slightly. Just enough that it could not have been coincidental. A pulse of warmth that moved across her face, the way a hand might move across a face if it were very careful and very tentative and entirely uncertain of its welcome. She felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition, the specific quality of recognition you feel when something you have known was theoretical becomes suddenly and unmistakably real. She pressed her palms flat against the soil, which was what her grandmother had taught her to do when you felt something large moving in the world around you, to ground yourself literally, to make yourself a point of contact between the above and the below. And she said, still aloud, still to the garden, still in the tone of someone making a reasonable request to an entity she was willing to treat with courtesy if it would extend the same. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't need to be cautious. But I am going to need more than light." The soil under her palms warmed in a way that was not the sun, and was not geothermal, and was not anything she had a name for. And from that warmth came something that was not quite sound, and not quite language, and not quite sensation, but had elements of all three, and the closest she could come to translating it was, "I know. I am learning how to be here again. Give me time." She nodded, because nodding felt appropriate. She went back to weeding. The golden light remained for another hour, and then gradually, with what felt remarkably like reluctance, allowed the ordinary morning light to resume its normal quality. That evening she sat outside and sang all the songs she knew, in order, from first to last, for the first time since she had been a child at her grandmother's feet, and she listened to the silence between the phrases with a new kind of attention, and in that silence she could feel, just at the edge of perception, the enormous slow gathering of something finding its way back to its own surface. Kelar had not tried to manifest in any physical sense for long enough that he had genuinely forgotten how difficult it was. There was a reason that ancient beings who chose to interact with the mortal world often did so through proxy or symbol, or the gradual shaping of circumstance rather than direct appearance. And that reason was the extraordinary patience required to calibrate one's presence to a scale that would not simply overwhelm. He was, at his full awareness, a very large thing, and the world he was returning to was full of ordinary-sized things living ordinary-sized lives, and the intersection of those two scales required enormous delicacy if it was not going to be simply destructive. He was managing the delicacy. Barely. The light had been his first deliberate attempt at communication, and he was pleased that she had received it without panic, had in fact responded with characteristic practical directness, because he had been hoping for directness and was receiving it, which suggested that whatever else the centuries had changed, they had not changed the fundamental quality of the Cantora line. His people, when the relationship had still existed explicitly, had always said of the Cantoras that you could present them with the miraculous, and they would ask what it wanted for breakfast. He had found this quality invaluable. He found it now, in the particular way she had pressed her palms to the earth and made her request, simultaneously deeply reassuring and unexpectedly affecting. His interaction with her through the soil had been the most direct communication he had attempted, and it had cost him considerably in terms of the ongoing work of returning to full presence. But the cost had been worthwhile. He had felt her, through the contact. Not just her voice, not just the music, but her actual self, the full complex texture of a person who had made difficult choices and lived with them and grown into them, and was still in process of understanding what she was. She was angry in the deep, slow way of people who have converted grief to fuel and are running on it efficiently, and she was intelligent in the particular way that people who have spent years alone and engaged with complex practical problems become intelligent, with a breadth and flexibility that formal systems of education rarely produced. She was lonely in a way she had decided not to let herself feel fully, which he understood completely, having made the same decision himself at various points across a very long existence. She was also, in the specific biological sense that he was now remembering mattered in the mortal world, an omega. He noted this with the careful clinical attention of someone taking inventory of relevant facts, because it was relevant, because it meant that his presence in her proximity was going to have effects that required management, effects that were partly biological and partly the result of who and what he specifically was, which was not simply any alpha, but the first alpha, the template on which the entire hierarchy of alpha nature was based, the original version of something that had been copied and diluted and misrepresented for 1,000 years. The pull between them, when it fully developed, was going to be unlike anything she had experienced or been prepared for, and managing that pull in a way that preserved her autonomy and did not simply sweep her capacity for choice. Aside under the weight of his nature was something he needed to think about very carefully. He had, across his very long life, learned that love that did not preserve the freedom of its object was not love, but possession. And he had watched the conflation of those two things cause more damage to more people than almost anything else he had encountered. He was not going to be careless with her. He was not going to be careless with the first Cantora he had encountered in centuries, the woman who had reached him in the deep places with her grandmother's songs and her grandmother's grief and her own absolute refusal to become less than she was in exchange for belonging. He was going to be careful. He was going to be patient. He was going to give her every possible opportunity to know him before she was asked to decide anything about him. He began, in the way that was available to him in his current state, to make himself slightly more present. Not visible, not yet, just present. The way that weather is present before it arrives. The way the atmosphere changes before the rain. The way you know without looking directly that something is there. He watched her garden. He listened to her work. He learned the rhythms of her days the way he had once learned the rhythms of the seasons, with patient attention and without the urgency of someone who needed information in order to act. He needed information in order to understand, and understanding had always been, for him, the actual point. The morning she first spoke to him directly, without preamble, and without the buffer of the garden as intermediary, was a morning in early winter when frost had settled on everything overnight, and the world outside her window was silver and still, and the light had the particular clean quality of very cold, clear days. She had been awake for an hour, had eaten, had made tea, had sat with the tea and with the journal, and had written for a while, and then she had put down her pen and looked out the window and said, into the room, as though he were simply there, which he increasingly was, "Tell me what you are." He answered her through sensation rather than sound, because sound was still beyond him in any form that would have been comprehensible rather than simply alarming. And what he gave her was an impression, a composite, the way. You might describe a very large and complex thing, not by naming it, but by communicating its relationship to other things she already understood. He gave her old. He gave her this land, these borderlands, specifically and essentially. He gave her the songs, her grandmother's songs, the connection between those songs, and something foundational and intentional. He gave her waiting, very long waiting. She sat with all of this for a considerable time, turning it over with the same serious attention she gave to any problem of genuine complexity. Then she said, "Are you the thing the songs are for?" Yes. The yes was not a word. It was an unambiguous quality of presence. A shift in the room that she had learned to read in the weeks since this had been developing. A warmth that was not temperature, and an attention that was not light, and a recognition that was not any of the ordinary signals of being recognized that she had experience with. She had come to understand that he communicated most naturally through qualities rather than through content, and that reading him required a kind of lateral attention that she was developing the way you develop any new skill, through practice and through the gradual accumulation of reference points. She said, "My grandmother knew. Not a question." He answered it anyway. "Yes. She didn't tell me." A pause that she had learned to read as thought. Then something that communicated. "She was protecting you." And then, more slowly. Or, "She was protecting the work." The distinction matters. I don't know which. Mara looked down at her tea, which had gone cold, and thought about her grandmother, who had given her the journal, and the songs, and the knife, and the understanding that a woman who depended on the mercy of others was taking a serious risk, and who had not told her what any of it was actually for. She thought about this with the particular complexity of loving someone who had both protected and withheld, and she did not try to resolve that complexity, because it was not the kind of complexity that resolved. "She's gone," she said. 3 years before I came here. She felt from him something that was not quite grief, but was in the neighborhood of grief, the kind of feeling that belongs to very old things when they are reminded that the particular people they cared about are gone, with the additional weight of someone who has outlived so many people they cared about, that the grief has become a landscape rather than an event. "You've been alone a long time," she said. "Even longer than you know." She almost smiled. "That's saying something," she said. "From where I'm standing." The process of his return to full physical manifestation took the entire winter, and she was present for most of it, which meant that she watched something emerge from absence, the way you might watch a photograph develop, form appearing gradually out of apparent blankness, detail accumulating over time until the image was complete. It was not, she noted in her journal with characteristic dryness, what she had expected from the legends she had occasionally encountered at border markets, the ones that described the ancient wolf as a figure of overwhelming power and terrifying aspect, whose manifestation would be attended by storms and seismic upheaval and various dramatic natural disruptions. What she was watching instead was something that looked remarkably like effort, like work, like someone doing something, genuinely difficult over a sustained period of time with careful attention to not causing collateral damage. She respected that. She respected it considerably. He appeared first as a distortion in the air near the window she spent most of her mornings at, a place where the light seemed thicker than it should, where the shadows fell at slightly wrong angles. Then as a shape within that distortion, not clear but present, the outline of something large that she had to look at indirectly to register, the way you looked at the faintest stars. Then, by midwinter, as something she could see in her peripheral vision that resolved into absence when she looked at it directly, but that she had stopped trying to see head-on, had learned instead to hold in the soft focus of not quite looking, which gave her enough information to understand that he was very large and very still, and that his stillness was the stillness of something that had been moving for a very long time and had chosen to stop. The morning he spoke to her in actual sound for the first time was the winter solstice, which she had not known was significant until it happened, and then understood immediately in retrospect why it would be. Sound, for an entity in the process of returning from the deep places, was more difficult than presence, required a more complete reintegration of physical reality, and the solstice, the longest night, the hinge point of the year, was a moment when the Borderlands did something specific to the boundary between states of being, made it more permeable, allowed things that had been in one condition to shift more easily toward another. She had gone to bed early because of the cold, and was lying in the dark listening to the particular silences of a winter night, and his voice came out of the dark the way the resonance she had first heard in the garden had come from beneath the earth, with the same quality of deep stone and enormous time, but shaped now into something that was clearly language, clearly intended for her specifically. Mara Ashvale. She lay still for a moment, orienting to the fact that this was happening, that the months of indirect communication and gradual approach had arrived at this, at her name in the dark, in a voice that felt like standing at the edge of something very large and old. Then she said, to the ceiling, because that was where the sound seemed to originate, "That's me. I know," he said. "I have known for some time. I figured," she said. "You've been watching me garden." A pause that might have been surprise. "I have," he said. "You have opinions about my root vegetable rotation," she said. "I have observations," he said. Opinions felt presumptuous. She almost laughed. She did not, quite, but the almost laugh moved through her chest, and she thought he probably felt it because he felt most things she did, when he was this present. "What are your observations?" she said. "That you know this land well," he said. "That you have learned it with your hands rather than with instruction. That the things you grow and the things you tend have responded to you in ways that suggest the Borderlands consider you a resident, rather than a visitor." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that unusual?" "The Borderlands have not had a resident in a very long time," he said. "They are not a place that accepts everyone who arrives. They accepted you." She thought about this. She had wondered, over 3 years, about the particular responsiveness of Borderland soil, the way things grew for her that should not have grown, the way the weather seemed to arrange itself into slightly more manageable patterns than the accounts she had heard of the region had suggested were standard. She had attributed this to skill and observation. The possibility that something about the place itself had been cooperating with her was not something she had fully allowed herself to consider. "You," she said. "The Borderlands are yours. More accurately," he said, "I am the Borderlands. I made this place as neutral ground, and I am what makes it neutral ground. When they accepted you, they were, in some sense, I was." A pause. "I want to be precise about this because precision matters when we are talking about territory and belonging, and I am aware that you have reasons to be careful about those concepts." She was lying very still now, not out of fear, but out of the intensity of paying attention. "You knew I was here before I started." "Singing," she said. "I was aware," he said. "The way you are aware of something very small, moving in a very large space. I did not know you specifically. I knew there was someone, and then I sang. And then you sang," he agreed. "And I knew you immediately, or I knew your lineage." The distinction became less clear as time went on. She pressed her hands flat against the rough wool blanket, which was the closest approximation of pressing them against soil that was available to her at this moment, grounding herself literally while she processed what he was telling her. "My grandmother's people," she said. "Your grandmother's people go back to the beginning," he said, "to when I first understood that there might come a time when I would need to be found. I chose certain women who had the particular quality that this required, the ability to carry frequencies in their voices that could reach me regardless of depth or distance, and I worked with them to develop the practice that became the Cantora tradition. They knew what they were doing," she said. "They knew everything," he said. "They made the songs. I provided the frequencies. The design was collaborative." Mara stared at the ceiling in the dark and thought about her grandmother singing while she cooked, singing while she walked, singing every evening without exception, and thought about the fact that her grandmother had always made that seem so ordinary, so completely unremarkable, a personal habit rather than an ancient practice maintained across generations. She thought about the deliberateness of that presentation, the choice to make the extraordinary look ordinary, so that it could be passed on without the weight of its full significance crushing the child being asked to carry it. "She knew," Mara said. "About you. She knew everything." "I would expect so," he said. The Cantoras of her generation were still in communication with the full lineage, even if the practice had been reduced to a much smaller network than it had once been. "She chose not to tell me. She chose to give you what you needed to reach me," he said carefully. Whether to tell you why was a different question, one she may have been still deciding when the time ran out. The grief of that settled over her like snow, quiet and accumulating. She was not going to cry about it tonight in front of a voice in her ceiling. But she noted it, and she acknowledged it the way she tried to acknowledge all the difficult things, with clear-eyed recognition, and without drama. "What happens now?" she said. "That," he said, "is almost entirely your decision. And that is the question that matters, isn't it? Not what the ancient power wants, but what she chooses. Stay with us, because Mara's answer is going to change everything, and the people who are already moving against them have no idea what they've set in motion. Like this video, if this story has your heart, and let's keep going. The people already moving against them were, as Kelar had known, they would be the moment his return began to register in the ambient magic of the wolf world. Numerous and motivated and possessed of the particular efficiency of systems that had spent 1,000 years consolidating exactly for the purpose of preventing a disruption of this kind. He had not been entirely surprised to sense them beginning to organize, had in fact been monitoring their response the way you monitor weather, with attention and with the understanding that weather does not need your approval to arrive. What surprised him was how quickly they identified Mara. He had expected them to find the center of disturbance, which was the Borderlands, which was always where he operated, and which anyone with enough knowledge of the old traditions would have identified as significant the moment unusual readings began propagating outward from the region. He had expected them to understand, eventually, that someone was singing the Cantora songs. He had not expected them to have a working knowledge of the Ashvale lineage, had not expected anyone to have maintained the specific record-keeping that would allow them to cross-reference the particular frequencies being produced with a specific family name. But someone had, and that someone had sent people. He told her on a morning in late winter, when she was at the window watching the first preliminary signs of thaw, in the way the frost sat differently on certain branches, with less perfect adhesion, suggesting that the wood beneath had begun its slow seasonal warming. He told her directly, without preamble, because she had made clear from early in their acquaintance that she preferred directness over cushioning, that the preparation of her for difficult information was a practice she found both condescending and counterproductive. He said, "There are people coming here who intend to prevent our continued contact." She kept looking out the window. "How many?" she said. 6, I believe, currently. With the understanding that 6 is the advance group, and that their principals have considerably more available. "Who are the principals?" "The High Alpha Council," he said. "Or the entity that currently holds that name. It has changed considerably since the institution I helped design." "Changed how?" "It was designed as a rotating council of 12 representatives, drawn from all pact territories in equal proportion, including Omega representatives, designed to ensure that no single power could consolidate enough influence to unilaterally determine direction for the broader community. What it has become is a self-perpetuating body of hereditary alpha appointments that has not included a non-alpha representative in approximately 300 years. She turned from the window. She could not see him, not directly. He was still beyond that. But she had developed the ability to sense his location in a room with enough accuracy to orient to him, and she did this now, turning to face the place near the north wall where he was most strongly present. "They know you're waking up," she said. "They know something is waking up," he said. "Whether they know specifically what is a different question. Those who have the oldest knowledge would understand immediately. Those operating from more recent records may only know that something ancient is disturbing the ambient field. And they're sending people to stop it. They're sending people to assess and contain," he said, "which, in practical terms, means the same thing, but the framing is probably more comfortable to work with internally." She almost smiled at that. "How long before they reach the Borderlands border?" "At their current pace, with weather as it is, approximately 10 days. She nodded slowly. "And in 10 days," she said, "where are you in the process of being fully here?" The pause was the pause of honest assessment. "Not where I would prefer to be," he said. "I can engage with the world in limited ways. I cannot yet act on it in the ways I will eventually be capable of again. So if they get here, and they're capable of harming you," she said, "or stopping the process, that is a possibility I am aware of," he said. "Then we have 10 days to change the conditions," she said, and turned back to the window and began thinking. He watched her think. He had been watching her think for most of the winter. and he had concluded that it was one of the most interesting things he had witnessed in a very long existence. Not because the thoughts she produced were beyond anything he could have arrived at himself, though they frequently contained angles he had not anticipated, but because of the way she did it, the way she moved through a problem without attachment to the conclusion she had started with, genuinely willing to arrive somewhere unexpected if the logic led there. He had known, across many centuries, any number of people who were technically intelligent and strategically capable, but who thought in ways constrained by what they needed to be true, by the commitments they had made to outcomes before they understood the full shape of the problem. She did not think that way. She had come to the Borderlands with nothing, and having nothing had turned out to be a significant cognitive advantage. The border markets, she said, after a period of silence that he had learned to be comfortable inside. I have relationships there. Not deep ones, but consistent enough that I have some credibility. Some of the healer families have been trading with me for 3 years, and they know the Borderlands botanicals I bring them are genuine and reliable. Yes, he said. Information travels through healer networks faster than through any other channel, she said. Healers talk to each other across pack lines in ways that most other professions don't, because illness doesn't observe territorial boundaries, and because healers have historically maintained neutrality as a professional necessity. This is true, he said. And there was something in his voice that she was learning to identify as the specific quality he had when something she said activated a very old and very large area of knowledge. The healer networks were, in the original system, the primary channel through which Omega culture maintained continuity across pack lines. They were deliberately designed to transcend territorial boundaries. By you, she said, with significant input from the Omega communities of the time, he said. I was more facilitator than designer in that particular case. She filed this away as she filed everything he told her, with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned the hard way that information was the most portable and durable resource available. I can go to the border markets, she said. I can start conversations. There are questions that can be asked in healer networks that will move faster than 6 people walking through winter. What questions? He said. Why is the High Alpha Council sending an enforcement team to the Borderlands? She said. What are they afraid of in the in-between spaces? What do the oldest families know about what exists here? She looked at the place where he was without quite looking at it. The oldest families know things, she said. The knowledge of the Cantoras may have been suppressed, but it was not eliminated. You told me the lineage narrowed, but didn't end. That means there are other people out there with pieces of this. They just don't know what the pieces are part of, and you intend to tell them. I intend to help them understand what they already know, she said. There's a difference. She left for the border market 4 days before the enforcement team was expected to reach the Borderlands, leaving the cabin secured and her gardens in the dormant winter state that required no immediate attention in telling the Borderlands, in the particular way she had learned to communicate with the land itself, that she was coming back, and that in the meantime, it should feel free to be inhospitable to anyone who arrived without being invited. She had discovered over the winter that the Borderlands did in fact respond to this kind of direct address, that Kelar had not been speaking metaphorically when he said he was the Borderlands, that the land and the entity were genuinely integrated in a way that meant communication with one was communication with the other. He could not come with her. Not yet. He was still too present in the deep places of the Borderlands, still too fully integrated with the land to extricate himself into a form that could travel without disrupting everything in his immediate vicinity, in ways that would be obvious to anyone watching for exactly that kind of disruption. This had been a difficult conversation. She had not, when she laid out the plan, assumed he would be unable to accompany her, and when the limitation had become clear, she had been quiet. For a moment, in a way that he had learned to read, as her processing something she was not going to make a production of. Then she had said, very evenly, "All right, then I go alone." He had said, "You have always gone alone. That has not been a limiting condition." She had looked at him, at the space where he was, and said, "It's different now." And she had not explained what she meant by this because she did not need to. Because he was close enough now to simply know, to feel the truth of it, in the same way she felt it, that the 3 weeks of direct communication had changed the nature of alone for both of them in ways that could not be readily undone. He had said very quietly, "I will not lose contact with you. I can extend my awareness along the paths you travel. The Borderlands have more territory than their official boundaries suggest." "How much more?" "More than the High Alpha Council is aware of," he said, and the quality of the way he said it, the layered old satisfaction in it, made her understand that this was deliberate, that the apparent boundaries of the Borderlands were not the actual boundaries, that this too had been designed. She had packed the same way she had packed for her border market visits for 3 years, the same efficient compression of necessity into available space, the same knife at her hip, the same dried herbs and preparations that were her trading currency. She added the journal. She had never taken the journal before, and she was not entirely sure why she was taking it now, except that it felt wrong to leave it behind. She had stood at the door of the cabin and said, to the room, "I'll be back in 4 days, probably 5. "I will be here," he had said. And the particular way he said it, with the enormous weight of what that meant for something like him, had done something to her that she was still sitting with as she walked through the winter forest toward the Borderlands border, her breath clouding in the cold air, and her footsteps making no sound in the thick layer of old snow. The border market she frequented most often was a small settlement called Edgeway that sat at the boundary between the Borderlands and the westernmost territory of the Thornvale Pack, which was one of the older mid-sized packs and had a culture of slightly more openness than most, its proximity to the Borderlands having produced over generations a pragmatic acceptance of ambiguity that the more centrally located packs tended to lack. The healers who operated in Edgeway and the surrounding region were, as she had told Kelar, among her most consistent contacts, and the woman she was most interested in talking to was a healer named Aldith Caro, who had been practicing in the region for 40 years, and who knew things. Aldith knew things in the specific way of people who have been paying attention for a very long time to things that most people around them have decided are not worth attention, the accumulation of marginalized knowledge and discarded data that coalesces over decades into something that resembles, from the outside, intuition, and is from the inside, closer to pattern recognition operating on a very large data set. She was 73 years old, and had the physical presence of a much larger person, and the particular stillness of someone who had decided some years ago that urgency was almost never as warranted as it presented itself as being. When Mara arrived at Aldith's workroom, which occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on the eastern edge of Edgeway, and always smelled of the particular combination of dried herbs and wood smoke and beeswax that Mara associated with competence, Aldith looked at her for a long moment before saying anything and then said, "You look different." "I've been busy," Mara said. "Different isn't busy," Aldith said. "Different is like you've been in a conversation with something very large for a while, and it's changed the way you hold yourself." She studied her. "Sit down. I'll make tea." Mara sat. Aldith made tea with the economy of movement of someone for whom this task had been performed often enough to require no conscious attention, and set the cups on the table, and sat across from Mara, and looked at her with the frank assessment of a healer and an elder, and someone who had specifically been watching the Borderlands for 30 years, and had thoughts about what watching them had taught her. "There are people heading for the Borderlands," Mara said. "Council enforcement. I'd like to know who sent them and what specifically they were told to look for." Aldith wrapped both hands around her cup. "I heard there was movement from the Central Territories," she said. "I didn't know it was council enforcement. What's in the Borderlands that the council wants contained?" "Something old," Mara said. "Something that was supposed to be inert." Aldith was quiet for a moment, doing the particular kind of thinking that Mara recognized because she had watched it often, the kind that was integrating new information against a very large background of existing data. Then she said, "The Ashvale name." Mara kept her face neutral. "What about it?" "Your grandmother traded here," Aldith said. "Not with me, with my teacher, who told me about her. Sarah Ashvale, who had a particular kind of voice, and who was extremely careful about where she used it." A pause. "My teacher thought she was a Kentora. Did not say this to Sarah's face, because Sarah was clearly not interested in the conversation, but thought it. Your teacher was right, Mara said. Aldith set down her cup. And you? Yes, Mara said, which is apparently something the council has records of, or knows how to identify, which means someone in the council structure has been maintaining the old knowledge specifically for the purpose of suppression. That's not surprising, Aldith said flatly. Systems that have spent centuries systematically eliminating El Sol type of person tend to also spend considerable resources tracking whether they've been successful. She looked at Mara directly. What do you need? I need the healer network to know what's happening, Mara said. Not everything. Enough that the people who have pieces of the old knowledge understand that the pieces are part of something that's becoming real again. I need them to be thinking about what they know, and who else might know things. You're not going back to let the council team find an empty cabin, Aldith said. You're going back because it needs to be there. Yes, Mara said. Then you need more than the healer network knowing, Aldith said. You need the healer network positioned to respond. She picked up her cup again and looked into it as though the tea had something to say. There are 17 healer practitioners in a 3-territory radius, who have maintained elements of practices that trace to the old tradition, who have been maintaining them quietly for the same reason your grandmother maintained the songs quietly, because the knowledge felt important even without being entirely sure why. She looked up. I can have them aware within 3 days. That's what I'm asking for, Mara said. That's not all I'm offering, Aldith said. I'm offering to have them positioned to do something with that awareness if the situation develops into one where something needs to be done. A pause. Old things waking up. Council enforcement teams. Cantora lineages. Making themselves known after generations of silence. This is a development situation, Mara Ashvale. I've been waiting for one for a long time. Mara looked at her for a moment, assessing. 3 years of operating alone had made her careful about accepting offers of alliance, and she was aware of the layers of motivation that could exist in an offer like this one. The genuine idealism and the personal ambition and the very human desire to be present at something important. She was also aware that she was one person, and that what was coming was more than one person's problem. Tell me what you want, she said. Directly. Aldith smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting to be asked that question by someone worth asking it. I want the system that classified my mother as property to be dismantled, she said. I want the council that decided Omega healers don't count as representatives to be made to account for that decision. And I want to be in the room when it happens. A pause. I believe that something capable of making any of that possible is currently waking up in the Borderlands, and I believe you are connected to it. That's what I want. That's what we're working toward, Mara said. Both of us. She returned to the Borderlands on the 4th day, as she had promised, coming through the border in the late afternoon with the particular quality of returning that she had only begun to feel in the past several months, the specific sensation of arriving, somewhere rather than simply ending a journey, the difference between a place that is yours and a place that is only where you happen to be. The forest received her the way it always did, with the specific quality of Borderlands attention that she had stopped finding strange, and had started finding without quite meaning to, comforting. He knew she was back before she reached the cabin. She felt him extend toward her through the land, the way you feel warmth extending from a fire when you step. Toward it, a gradual increase in a quality she did not have a word for, that she had come to associate with his specific presence. By the time she crossed the threshold of the cabin, the warmth was around her like weather, and she stood in the middle of her own floor and said, I'm back. 5 people confirmed in the healer network. 12 more being contacted. The people coming here are going to find something different than they expect when they arrive. Tell me everything, he said. And she took off her pack and sat at the table and told him everything. And he listened with the complete attention that was one of the things she had come to value most about him. The specific quality of being genuinely heard by something that had been listening to the world for a very long time and had strong opinions about what listening actually required. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You trust this woman. I trust what she wants, Mara said. Which is the same thing I want. Whether I trust her specifically is a question I'm still building evidence for. That is the correct approach, he said. I thought so. Another pause, and then he said, with a quality she had not heard from him before, or had heard only in traces, and was now hearing more fully. I missed your voice. She was still for a moment. Not because the statement surprised her, exactly, but because of the way it landed, the specific weight of it, the awareness that she was hearing. Something from an entity that had existed for 1,000 years and had, apparently, developed preferences in that time about particular voices. You could hear me, she said, from the Borderlands. Hearing and having are not the same, he said. She looked at the wall, at the place where he was most present. I know, she said. I know the difference. The enforcement team arrived on the 7th day after her return, which was slightly ahead of the schedule Kelar had projected, suggesting they had pushed harder through the late winter conditions than anticipated, which told her something useful about how much urgency the council had attached to this particular mission. There were 6 of them, as he had indicated, and they came to the border of the Borderlands at mid-morning in close formation, which was not how anyone experienced with Borderlands travel came to the border, because the Borderlands rewarded the spread out, and the attentive, and punished the grouped and the defended. And their formation told her that they had read the operational manuals but had never actually been here. She knew they were coming 20 minutes before they arrived, because the Borderlands told her in its particular way, a shift in the attention of the birds and the particular alertness in the soil under her feet, that she had learned to read as the land's version of an early warning system. She used those 20 minutes to stand in front of the cabin door with her arms at her sides and her face arranged in the expression she used when she needed to appear entirely calm in circumstances that were not. They came through the trees in a spread that was attempting to be tactical and demonstrating instead a fundamental misunderstanding of Borderlands terrain, and the person at their head was a woman of approximately 40, with the particular bearing of someone who had been given an assignment she considered beneath her capabilities and intended to complete it efficiently and return to more important work. She stopped when she saw Mara. She looked at Mara the way people looked at things that were not where they expected to find them. Mara Ashvale, she said. That's right, Mara said. We're here on council authority to assess anomalous magical disturbance in the Borderlands region, the woman said. We'll need you to stand aside. I'll need you to be more specific about what you're looking for, Mara said. That's not information we're required to share. Then we have a problem, Mara said, because you're standing in territory that isn't yours, which means you're here on the goodwill of the land itself, and the land is currently in a mood. As if on cue, which it was more or less, the Borderlands did something that it did very rarely and only under specific conditions. The light changed. The same shift that had happened in Mara's garden months ago, the impossible golden quality, moved over the clearing in front of the cabin like a wave, and the 6 people who had come from outside felt it with the full force of encountering something ancient and large and unimpressed with their institutional authority. The woman at the head of the group went very still. 2 of the others took involuntary steps backward. You should tell them, Mara said, not to the enforcement team but to the air around her, to the particular warmth that was present in the clearing with her, in a way she could feel but they could not yet fully perceive, what they're actually standing in front of. The voice, when it came, was not a whisper and was not a shout. It was something below both of those, something that came from the ground as much as from the air, resonant in the specific way that things resonated in deep stone. You are in the Borderlands. The Borderlands are not a region. They are a threshold. I built this threshold, and I have returned to maintain it. You are here on my tolerance. I suggest you make that tolerance worth extending. The silence that followed this was the specific silence of people who have been operating under a set of assumptions about the world, and have just had a direct and undeniable experience of those assumptions being incorrect. The woman who had addressed Mara looked at her, and Mara could see her processing, could see the machinery of a very capable intelligence running rapid recalibration. What is speaking? She said. Not who. What? Something much older than the institution you work for, Mara said. Something that designed. The institution you work for, actually. Though it would be the first to say that the design has been somewhat corrupted in the intervening centuries. The woman looked at the clearing, at the light that was still doing things it should not have been doing, and she said very evenly, "I am going to need to send a report. You're going to need to do considerably more than that," Mara said. But a report is a reasonable starting point. The report sent shockwaves through the council structure in ways that Mara monitored from a careful distance through the healer network that Aldith had activated, which proved to be considerably more extensive and well-organized than she had fully appreciated when she had made the initial request. Healer networks, she was learning, had been maintaining the kind of infrastructure that allowed for rapid information sharing across territorial lines for generations, in exactly the way that Kelar had originally designed them to, and the fact that this infrastructure had survived intact, while so much else of the original system had been dismantled, was either testament to the Council's oversight or to the specific skillfulness with which the healers had maintained their networks below the threshold of official attention. She suspected the latter. She said as much to Kelar one evening, while she was sitting at the table with the journal, and he was present in the particular warm and occupied way he had been present increasingly over the weeks. Since the enforcement team's visit, which had been both a direct confrontation and a message sent upward through the council hierarchy that would take time to fully propagate. The healer networks were designed to be resilient, he said, to survive disruption by maintaining their function across apparent discontinuities. The specific people who carried that design forward across the centuries without fully understanding it were working from the same instinct your grandmother worked from, preserving something that felt important without being entirely sure what it was for. A lot of people carrying things they don't fully understand, she said. That is genuinely how most important things survive, he said. If people only preserved what they fully understood, the scope of preservation would be extremely narrow. She wrote this in the journal because it felt like something worth writing down, and she heard in the small silence after she wrote it the quality that she had come to recognize as him being pleased, which was not exactly the same as what pleased would have meant from anyone else, but was in the same neighborhood. The council's response came in 3 distinct waves. The first was a request for formal communication, which Mara declined by not responding. The second was a delegation of 3 senior council members who arrived at the Borderlands border with considerably more deference and considerably less tactical formation than the first team, and who were received by Mara and by a version of Kelar's presence that was becoming more substantial by the week, more capable of making itself understood in terms that left less room for the kind of interpretive flexibility that powerful institutions relied on when confronted with things they would prefer to explain away. Those conversations were long and often difficult, and she sat in on all of them, both because her presence was tactically useful and because she was not interested in being excluded from decisions that directly concerned her, regardless of whether the parties conducting the decisions felt her inclusion was appropriate. Kelar, for his part, made clear from the first exchange that her presence was not a concession or a courtesy, but a requirement, that any conversation about the future of the Borderlands and the systems connected to them would include her, and that the council could make its peace with this, or the conversation could end. The third wave was the most important. A formal acknowledgement, circulated within the council structure but quickly leaked to the healer networks, and from there to broader Omega communities in the surrounding territories, that the Borderlands were not a region of exile, but an active and operational threshold, maintained by an entity of the original Pact design, and that the Council's authority did not extend to this region, and had in fact never legitimately extended here. This acknowledgement was not as comprehensive as she would have liked, did not go as far as addressing the many other ways in which the original system had been corrupted, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was a beginning, which was what beginnings were. She was sitting outside on the flat stone step on a morning in early spring, when the frost was entirely gone, and the first true warmth was arriving in the Borderlands with the particular assertiveness of spring in a place that had been waiting for it, when she felt the quality of his presence shift. Not diminish, consolidate. The difference between weather spread across a wide area and weather gathered into a specific place. She went very still, and then, for the first time, She saw him. He was not what the stories had suggested, which she supposed she should have expected. He was large, yes, but the scale was not the impossible mythological scale of the oldest accounts. Was instead the scale of something that was very large, and also very aware of its size in relation to the space it was occupying, making itself as present as it needed to be, rather than as present as it could be. His form was the form of a wolf, in the way that a very old tree is the form of a tree. The essential structure present and recognizable, and the specific expression of it so thoroughly developed that it had passed beyond category into singularity. He was silver, and he was dark, and the light that moved in his coat was the same light she'd been seeing in various forms since this had all begun. The impossible golden quality that was not sunlight, but was related to sunlight the way the original is related to the copy, as the thing that makes the copy possible. He was looking at her with eyes that were both animal and entirely not animal, that held in their depth the specific quality of attention that she had been living inside for months, and now could finally see as a physical thing, as eyes she could meet. She met them. She said, "Hello." He made a sound that was not quite language and was not quite not language, that she heard in her chest in the same place she had been hearing his communication all winter, and which she understood without translation as, "I have been wanting to do this for some time." "I know," she said. "I could tell." He moved toward her with the careful deliberateness of something that understood it was capable of overwhelming and had decided not to, and she sat on her flat stone step and watched him come and felt in her chest and her throat and the base of her skull all the things that were happening between them, that the months of learning each other had been building toward, the specific kind of recognition that happens when two things that have been finding each other slowly finally arrive at the same place at the same time. He stopped when he was close enough that she could have touched him if she had reached out. She reached out, her hand pressed against his chest, feeling the warmth and the solidity and the enormous slow rhythm of something that measured its heartbeats, not in seconds but in something much longer, and she felt his presence move through her palm and up her arm and settle into her chest with the quality of something arriving home, which was the word she had been avoiding for months, because she had not been ready for what it would mean to use it, and which she allowed herself now because she was ready, or as ready as she was going to be, which was what ready actually meant in practical terms. "We have a lot of work to do," she said. He lowered his enormous head until it was beside hers, until she felt the warmth of his breath against her face, and what she felt from him was, "I know." And, together, and underneath both of those, quiet and enormous, and entirely without urgency now that they had arrived here, "I have been alone a very long time, too." She pressed her face against his neck and stayed there, feeling the world's oldest heartbeat under her cheek, and said, "We're going to fix what they broke." Not a question, not a promise exactly. More like a statement of fact about a process that had already begun, that was already in motion, that had begun, if she was honest, on the first night she sat outside her cabin door and sang her grandmother's songs to the moon, lonely and stubborn and entirely unwilling to become less than she was, not knowing that something in the deep places was already leaning toward the sound of her. If this story has stayed with you the way it stayed with me in the telling, please like this video and leave a comment below about what moment hit you hardest, because sharing those moments is one of the best parts of doing this together. And please subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, because the epilogue of this story is coming and you won't want to come back to find you missed it. Epilogue. 2 years after the morning, Kelar walked out of the deep places and stood in the spring light of the Borderlands and felt Mara's hand against his chest, like the specific gravity that tells you where down is. The work they had described to each other as, "We have a lot of work to do," was neither complete nor anywhere close to complete, and they had both made their peace with this in their different ways and at their different timescales. What was complete, or more accurately, what had reached a state that could be described as established and ongoing rather than contested and fragile, was the formal reconstitution of the Borderlands as a recognized autonomous threshold under the original charter, a document that Kelar had produced from his own memory, with a specificity that had rendered the council's legal scholars effectively speechless, because you cannot argue points of original intent with the entity that holds the original. The document had been authenticated, registered, and made part of the official record in ways that made it significantly more difficult to erase than the many things that had been erased in the centuries of his absence, and Mara had made certain that copies existed in enough independent locations that erasure would require a coordination effort too obvious to execute quietly. Aldith Caro sat on the newly reconstituted Borderlands Council as the representative of the Healer Networks, a position that the old designs had always included, and that had been absent from the council structure for 300 years. She was 75 years old, and had the energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for something worth spending energy on, and was now determined to make the most of whatever time was available. She and Mara had developed the kind of working relationship that forms between people who have compatible amounts of impatience and compatible commitments to precision, and their meetings, which Kelar attended in the ambient way he attended most things, tended to produce results that surprised people who had underestimated both of them. The cabin was the same cabin it had always been, with better mortar in the walls, and a roof that Kelar had suggested, and she had executed, working with the Borderlands stone in ways she had not previously attempted, that produced something more elegantly waterproof than her original construction. The gardens were larger. The root cellar was better organized. The journal was almost full, and she had found a woman at the Edgeway Market who made paper from Borderlands grasses, using a technique she had developed herself, and had arranged for a supply of new blank books that would last several years. She still sang every evening. She had stopped doing it unconsciously, had developed full understanding of what the songs were and what they did, and sung them with that understanding in the same way that she did everything she had once done by instinct and now did by knowledge, with the same quality of attention, but with additional layers of meaning that made the practice richer rather than more. Self-conscious. He listened every evening. He would always listen. The listening was both functionally necessary, maintaining the connection between his deep presence and the surface world, and something else that neither of them had found precise language for, which was all right. Because not everything required precise language, and they had both long since come to an understanding of the value of sitting comfortably with things that did not resolve into words. He was more fully present now than he had been even in the spring of his return, the months of continued reintegration having brought him to a stability that felt genuine rather than effortful, a settling into the world rather than a holding of himself within it. He could move through the Borderlands in physical form when it served a purpose. He could be perceived by people who came to the threshold with appropriate attention. He could not, and had no desire to, be what the myths had described, a figure of overwhelming and unaccountable power whose presence rewrote the conditions of everything around it. He had tried that version of himself once, a very long time ago, and found it both ineffective and ultimately lonely, in a specific and grinding way that he had eventually been honest with himself about. What he was now was something he did not have a precedent for, which was not entirely unfamiliar as a condition. He was an ancient thing that had found, in a specific woman, in a specific exile, in a specific between place, a quality of companionship that was not diminishment and not limitation, and not the kind of possession that the alpha-omega dynamic had been corrupted into representing, but something that both of them were still in the process of understanding the full shape of. He was patient. She was not patient, but was willing to engage with patience as a practice when the situation genuinely warranted it. They managed, between his patience and her willingness to practice it, to move through the ongoing complexity of everything they were doing without losing sight of what they were doing it for. She was in the garden on a Tuesday morning in late spring, which was still maintenance day, doing the meditative work of careful weeding that she had been doing every maintenance day for 5 years. And he was present in the particular way he was present when he was paying attention to something else at the same time. The background warmth of a maintained connection rather than the full focus of active engagement. When she stopped weeding and said to the garden, "I've been thinking." "I know," he said. "The Cantora line," she said. "There are others. Aldith found 3 more families. I told you about the one in the Eastern Territories." "I know." he said, with a quality that suggested he knew where this was going. We need to rebuild the practice, she said. Not as it was. I'm not interested in reconstructing something that was designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore, but something that serves the same function, that maintains the same connection, that doesn't depend on one person and one very particular set of circumstances. He was quiet for a moment. You want to teach. I want to build something that doesn't need me specifically to keep existing, she said, which means it needs to be something that can be taught, and that can be carried, and that doesn't require proximity to the borderlands to maintain, even if proximity to the borderlands is where it's strongest. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky, which was the particular blue of late spring in the borderlands, a color she had decided was not available anywhere else. I want it to last longer than me, he heard in this, as he heard in most things she said. Multiple layers, the practical and the personal, and the things underneath the personal that she did not always name directly. He said carefully, "It will." She nodded. She went back to weeding. He watched her hands in the dark soil, the hands that had built this place and learned this land, and pressed against his chest on a spring morning, and had been doing, ever since, the ongoing patient work of making something that would outlast the moment of its beginning. The borderlands held them both in their old and neutral light, and the spring moved through the forest with the particular assertion of things that have been waiting a long time, and know now that the waiting is finished. She started composing the first lesson that evening, writing in the nearly full journal while he sat beside her in the lamplight, present and attentive and patient, and entirely, finally, here. The first words she wrote were her grandmother's, in the old language she had spent her life learning to read, which she now knew was not a dialect or a regional variation, but the original language of the practice, the one that the frequencies were built in, the one that traveled through stone. She wrote them, and then she sang them. Aloud once, softly, into the lamplit room, and he felt them in the way he had first felt them when they reached him in the deep places. With recognition, and with something very large and quiet, that had no more efficient name than gratitude, for the grandmother who had preserved what she had not fully understood, for the granddaughter who had carried it into exile and kept singing in the dark, and for the particular quality of a voice that could cross any distance between any two things and still, arrive. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If it moved something in you, if it gave you something to think about or feel or carry with you, I hope you'll let me know in the comments below, because these stories are made in conversation with you, and every response shapes what comes next. Like this video if you want to see more stories like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss when a new one arrives. And until next time, remember that the things worth singing for are always worth singing for, even in the dark, even alone, even when you don't know yet what's listening.